Welcome to Skepticon 2017. Woo! One guy's got the beer in the background. 2.
How hard this was to research and try and sound genuinely like I was doing work.
You're going to have crowd surfing by the end of this.
Now, I'm sure most of you know exactly who Cara Santa Maria is. Okay, or not.
Or not.
I would. Some of you would. If you don't, I'm not sure why you bought your tickets here. But Cara Santa Maria has been around in the skeptical community for 5-6 years now.
Yeah, I honestly have no idea.
Quite a
I don't know
while.
how long it's been, because I think it was pre-Skeptics Guide that I started sort of circuiting and speaking, but really I think it was cemented when I joined the Skeptics Guide, and that was only like 2 or 3 years ago. Does anybody out there know? I have no idea. I have the
about
worst
2.
autobiographical memory.
Wade's a big fan of Skeptics Guide.
I love your show. I don't know what you're going to do. I was speaking to you today and you're not on the show this week.
I'm not on the show this week
No.
because I was like, I want to go to the wildlife park. Sorry, Steve. Actually, I told him I had to work, so hopefully
now
he's
you've
not
done
listening.
And it was funny, we were backstage and she's like, oh, look at the photo of this wallaby and Joey. And I'm like, oh, so how are you planning to do Skeptics Guide this week? She's like, oh, I've told him I can't make it. Which is very understandable. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about just skepticism and the kind of heads up, Cara, just in case you didn't know.
I think I know 1 or 2 things about it. Let's go.
We're going to talk about skepticism and kind of that grey area between skepticism and nihilism as well.
Ooh,
Yes.
really? Oh, this is going to be fun.
As you can tell, we did a lot of prep for the episode.
Now, this will be Cara's second chat with us, and I'm quite impressed she agreed to do a second chat, actually, from our first one. But you can go and check on. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm Bern, and this is Wade, and we're called Sci-gasm podcast. He let me come up with the name, much to his regret, so he doesn't let me make any of the creative decisions anymore. But we're going to have a go anyway, and that's the name we've stuck with. So here we are, and thank you very much for coming out and seeing us today. We really appreciate it. All right, so the first thing I want to discuss with these guys is the limits of skepticism. So where does skepticism become denialism? Okay, so at what point do we start ignoring evidence, or at what point do we say, here's the evidence I will believe? And you talked a lot about fake news in your discussion before. At what point do we know what's real and what's fake?
Well, I think that skepticism as a movement is very different from the operational definition that some people use as the term skeptic. So I think the appropriate term, and the term that we've sort of cemented, is that skepticism is about looking at the available evidence, and it's about making decisions based on what we often in science call theory. So theory is really what happens when enough independent investigations have coalesced that there's a fair amount of evidence, and we can say pretty securely that this is the way things are. Until further evidence makes us change our mind or helps us change our mind, we're feeling pretty confident that evolution happened via natural selection. We're feeling pretty confident that human emissions and factory farming and all those things are contributing to climate change. So those are theories, and I think skeptics really do question evidence until it becomes theory. They really look at it from a critical eye, and so they find that balance just like scientists do. I think the first thing I ever taught to my psychology students back when I was teaching at university was that you have to find a good balance between open-mindedness and skepticism. And a lot of people are like, but those things are diametrically opposed. But they're really not, right? You want to be skeptical until you have sufficient evidence to support these ideas, and you want to be open-minded, but not so open-minded that your brain falls out. And once you can find that balance between the two, I think you actually are a really good skeptic. It's not about not being open-minded. I don't know if I answered your question because I don't remember what your question was.
I don't listen to him either, don't worry about it.
I'm going to move this, sorry sound guy, I'm going to move this like this because I want to turn to you guys. Yeah, I think that's better.
Okay. And I'll do the same.
Yeah, right? 'Cause otherwise you're getting like half volume.
I'm a bit stuck here. I
What
don't
was-
know this shit anymore.
I know being in the middle is super weird. Whenever I'm on a TV show and there's a panel, they're like, you're in the middle. Crap.
That's why you let me
Get
in.
like a neck ache.
That's why I'm like, Bern, you can sit in the middle,
Yeah,
man. It's just
yeah.
weird.
All right, well, with this idea then, so we've got the data. We know we've got data for evolution pretty much, and if anyone here deny evolution, yeah, good, correct answer.
There's that one dude holding the beer up over there, but I don't think he heard you properly.
Now, What about the things that we don't have the data for? So something like artificial intelligence. It's an emerging technology. You've got people like Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk coming out cautioning us against this and newer stuff. At what point does our skepticism rely on data there, and at what point are we just, frankly, shooting ducks in the dark?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why it's important to be able to say these really difficult words, which is, I don't know. And I think a lot of people who are in a position of authority are really scared to admit that they don't know because they're afraid that they'll lose their authority. But I think that the best scientists and the best science communicators and really the best skeptics are the ones who say, the jury's still out. You know, it seems quite likely based on all of the research that I've done or based on some of the authority figures within this field that I've read that, you know, X equals Y, but we still don't know, and the jury really still is out. So I want to approach every question about it with an open mind. But also things like artificial intelligence are super interesting because they may never be fully evidence-based, like the way that, I don't know, ethics is not really ever going to be fully evidence-based. And you've really got to think about psychology and philosophy and some of these sort of different epistemologies, right? Because I know that we all really cherish science, and we say science is really the only way toward truth, but there are other ways of knowing, and I know that a lot of skeptics go, what does that mean? She's anti-science. No, I'm a scientist. But I also really am interested in philosophy and psychology, and I think it's important to know that there are other ways that people know what they know to be true. So people who are religious, who firmly they'll tell you, no, I know that God exists, and I know, because for them they do, and it's because they approached it with a different epistemology. And as long as we're like disconnected from that, and we don't understand that, and we can't empathize with that viewpoint, we're never going to be able to really communicate with people who believe those different things.
What was one thing in your life that you kind of something you've had to overcome when it's like all the evidence is there? I need to now accept this.
What are we, yeah. You know what, I asked the guys this, or we all talked about this, the Skeptics Guide guys, on, I think it was a private recording. We're like, what is that thing that you're still kind of unskeptical about? You know, like, what is the thing that still gets you? And they were all like, crap answer. I was like, you guys, I'm sure there's something. I'm sure one of you still takes vitamins, or, you know, there's got to be something. And I think for me, it's the, I don't know if there was that moment of clarity. You know what I mean? People ask me, like, when did you know that you didn't believe? And it's like, I don't think I ever really believed. I think I just faked like I believed. But I thought that was what belief was because I was trying to impress my family and go through the motions of whatever. But I think even to this day, I do probably some food things and health things that aren't fully evidence-based. Simply, I also get foot massages constantly. And I love Chinese foot massages. But then they're like, oh, right here is where your liver. And I'm like, shh.
Ruining this for me.
I know, it's enjoying it, and I go to yoga a lot, and lots of times yoga is quite unskeptical. So I'm really relaxed, and she's like, and your chi energy, and I'm like, stop, it's stressing me out, you know. So there are some things I engage in where I know that they're not fully skeptical activities, but I try to look at them through a skeptical lens and take what I can out of it. Also, studying psychology is super weird now because there's a lot of weird unskeptical stuff in psychology. But there's also stuff, like you were talking about, where the jury's not fully out. Like, whereas I think staunch skeptics are going to be like, mindfulness is dumb, and they're just relaxing. But then there is good evidence to show that, like, mindfulness meditation can improve outcomes for things like resiliency, like people who are sufferers of PTSD, that it can actually have a positive outcome. And really, are we measuring the construct of mindfulness, or are we just measuring relaxation and guided meditation? But all those things I'm becoming a little more open to understanding why things work, as opposed to just writing them off as, you know, unreasonable simply because they're kind of difficult to test. You know, I think we have a tendency to be like, because it's hard to test something like that, it must not have any impact, which I think is not the appropriate way to approach something. We just got to come up with better ways to test it.
I think you're right. I think one of the most important things we can say as honest scientists in many ways is I don't know. And I don't think there are enough people out there, honestly, in the skeptical community, putting their hand up and saying, this is something we don't know.
Yeah.
There are people like Deepak Chopra who say, well, I've got a pretty good guess, and if you send me money, I'll give you my book that explains
Exactly.
it.
Yeah.
Please tell me you've used the Deepak Chopra word generator.
The generator, I love it. It's
how good is it?
hilarious. There was actually a whole study like a psychological study about like pseudo profound words, and like they tested people finding profundity in these different phrases, and they used the Chopra generator to test against actual profound kind of what do we call them, adages, or but they used the Chopra as sort of the I think the control.
Was it more believable, these profound words? Did people go, okay, that sounds legitimate?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, people buy into that. I mean, it's because it taps into something, I think, that's much more emotional. And if you use the words that in that context have always carried spiritual meaning for a lot of people, I hate that word spiritual, but I do know that it matters for some people. I'm not for me, but I get it, and I don't want to denigrate. But like, if it taps into something emotional or spiritual for you, it sort of doesn't matter what the content is. You know what I mean? And it does. It works. People like will feel things. I remember thinking back, I was raised Mormon, and I was a big time singer. Like that's what I first studied in college. And so I'd sing a lot of religious songs. And I remember thinking that was legit, like the spirit coming through me. And then when I decided to kind of come out to my parents and say I'm an atheist and I'm not going to go to church anymore, like I missed the music. And I think for a long time I identified that music, that emotional experience I have, the chills that I would get. What do you guys call it? Do you call it goosebumps or
Goosebumps.
You don't call it goose flesh. It's the grossest term. I know.
That's disgusting.
I don't call it goose flesh either, but a lot of people do. It's
What about
super
goose
gross.
pimples?
Or
Heard
goose
that.
pimples is super gross too. No,
Feels like
goose,
you need to pop it or something.
yeah, no, goosebumps. So when I would get goosebumps and I would have the hair stand up on the back of my neck, I was like, that's Jesus in me. But then I realized, no, I just really like music, but music does have this kind of profundity to it that taps into a much more emotional sort of limbic area. And I think that it's quite easy to make those connections for people. And sometimes we forget that people want to have an emotional experience and they want to have a spiritual experience. I think Sagan was so good at sort of marrying those things and doing it
Absolutely.
in a secular way. But sometimes as skeptics, we try to make everything so intellectual that we lose people because they're like, I don't know, this isn't really for me. You know?
Do you think that there's, my concern, and I'm not sure if you guys share the same thing, I'm sure some of the people in the audience do, is that atheism now is kind of branching out and there's all these different little denominations of atheism, and it's kind of like the Monty Python, Judea's People's Front, and we're the People's Front of Judea.
Yeah.
And so do you guys feel, like, Bern, are you kind of concerned about that at all? Like that atheism is kind of now branched off, oh no, you're part of that group. Ugh, stay away.
You're right. You get like the militant atheists, and you get like all these branches of atheism. And I do think atheism runs the risk of essentially just becoming another religion without a figurehead, if you will, in the sky. Whatever figurehead you want to be, whether that's a theological one or a specific person like the Pope. Atheism, I think, does run that risk. You were saying you wear the atheism like a badge of honor, but you've got all these branches of atheism like the Richard
Yeah, that's
Dawkins
right. We went to
style
your
branch.
talk. We saw it. Yeah, we're not
there.
rocking up halfway
Really
through.
flattering, you guys. It's like really meaningful to me.
We needed some topics to talk about.
We did not plan this.
No, but I think we do really run the risk, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say most people who are buying tickets to Skepticon are probably agnostic or leaning towards atheism if they're not full-blown atheists already. And I think we can all agree that there is some risk that the atheist community now is certainly running, that we are getting these people that are just ignoring the views of other people or ignoring people with backgrounds like Cara that were brought up in religious households, and that just makes them less inclined to go towards atheism or to subscribe to secular sort of thinking as well.
Oh, there are legitimate people, and I know many people like this that are like, yeah, I'm smarter than religious people. I'm more evolved than religious people. I actually, they actually think that. Like, the reason that people cling to religion is that they're like, less intelligent, or that people cling to religion because they are, troglodytes or something like that. But the truth is there are many reasons that people find religion, and I think a lot of very smart people have evolved their own religious viewpoints to work. I think that there are a lot of progressive religious people out there, and we are doing ourselves a massive disservice by not reaching across and trying to understand where they're coming from. That said, I appreciate that there are different stripes of atheism. David Silverman, who's the president of American Atheists, he's a firebrand atheist. He thinks that you can't be an atheist Jew. He legit thinks that you have to denounce your Jewish heritage to be an atheist, which is super weird to me. I have tons of friends who are atheist Jews.
Pretty hard to grow back a foreskin too.
Right, exactly. And I mean, he is one of them. Like, he's speaking from his position. I disagree with most of the things he says, but I wrote the foreword to his book because I think what he's doing is important. And I also think that when there's a movement, whether it be a skeptic movement or an atheist movement or a movement towards marriage equality, by the way, I know we're not quite there yet, but congratulations, you guys. It's a good day. As an aside, when we landed in Melbourne, did I do it right?
Melbourne, you did.
The pilot was like, "It's a good day in Australia." While we were up in the air, this vote came out, and the whole plane cheered. It was like really, really amazing. But when we talk about all these different movements, the reason that they're effective is because there are people at the bleeding edge who are pretty militant, and then there are the people who are more moderate. And so I don't think that seeing that as a division, but seeing it instead as a non-monolithic movement where it takes all types to get the message to go across, I think is a better way to view it. And so I don't mind, and I actually encourage and appreciate the David Silvermans of the world. I may not agree with his approach, but I'm really glad he's willing to be on the bleeding edge so that I don't have to, because I don't want to define myself that way. But plenty of people do, and I think that that's okay.
Yeah.
You're so accepting, aren't you?
It's just
I
lovely.
know.
Yeah.
It's like you grow up in Texas, you develop this defense mechanism.
I'm just going to give you a hug.
Oh, that's so sweet.
I'm cutting you off, Wade.
So, in your talk today, you mentioned that science is a process. Now, we've got young members of the audience, front row and centre.
Yeah. With super cool glasses, by the way.
I know,
love them,
rad.
you guys.
Yeah, you're the only one not wearing glasses.
Nerd.
Yeah.
Two
Boo,
eyes.
yeah.
What is this?
Now, how do you think, well, both of you, how do you think we can best educate young people to become like healthy skeptics? If we're going to teach science as a process, how can we then transfer that across to skepticism?
Well, I think what really the question is how do we... I think young people are healthy skeptics, and I think we deprogram them from that. So it's really about making sure that the way that we interact with young people, whether it's in the home, which is really where it starts, or whether it's in an academic setting, is to sort of encourage this free, this curious and free approach to finding things out, this free approach to ideas, instead of trying to regiment it. And that's not to say that like these should all be, Montessori school, like free love, and you never have to, a number is a letter is a square, I don't care. Like it shouldn't be like that. Like, there are things you have to learn, and you have to learn them in a pretty prescribed way. But I think, and I understand, I don't have kids, but I absolutely don't judge a parent when their kid's like, but why? And they're like, I don't know, because I said so, go to bed. Oh my God, I can't deal with it anymore. I get where that comes from, but I do think it's quite dangerous, because it teaches people to bow to authority in a way that I think isn't really healthy. Oh, well, you told me so, and you are infallible. And we have to remember that too. Like, children don't have a concept of fallibility of adults until they grow into that. And so when you're very, very young, you're looking at your parents as basically the keepers of what is. Like, they are your entire worldview. And that's something we see a lot with children of like abuse and neglect, is that it takes them a while to even realize that what they were going through at home is not what all kids go through at home. It takes them actually seeing what it's like to be in a healthy relationship to understand what normality is, and that causes all sorts of problems down the line. And so, I mean, that's an extreme example, but I do think that just parents encouraging kids to explore and not stunting their creativity is the first thing that we can do. And then within the academic setting, it's difficult, right? Because we don't put enough money into education.
Yeah.
Like, if we actually funded it based on its ROI, if we really looked at the data that show that if we put X amount of money into educational efforts, we are going to get X back in our economy, this is like the best investment we could make, then, maybe we'd have better outcomes.
Yeah, I remember I was lucky enough to ask Neil deGrasse Tyson that question, and he said, rather than getting mad at a child for dropping an egg,
Yeah.
Teach them lessons about
Yeah.
it. Say, okay, so here's something that looks hard on the outside. You can't break it, but if you drop it, well, then you're teaching them brittleness. And then all of a sudden, well, what is an egg? And there's all these life lessons they can learn rather than saying, no, give me that. I'm taking that from you. And all of a sudden, the child has lost the ability to learn about an egg at that specific time.
And just active engagement. I mean, I know it's hard if you can't afford to hire help and you're, trying to do 2 jobs and also raise your kids. And I mean, it's a tough standard, and you're never going to fully live up to it. So, I do think it's important to give yourself a freaking break. But I'm watching my friend, you guys know Derek Muller, Veritasium. I'm watching him and Raquel Nuno raise this beautiful little boy, and it's so cool to see how they engage and how the people that they work with engage, where it's just constantly narrating life and pointing at things, and it's just enrichment. What's that over there? Do you know why that does that? Let's come over here. And the more that child is constantly interacting with their environment, I think the more and of course they're like scientists, so this is like a funny Skinnerian experiment, but I'm really excited about the outcome for this kid for sure.
You have to spare a thought as well for people who don't have kids too, especially with Bern, because he's like, as a father.
It's great. I'm a father of about 2 months now.
It's just...
And for the last 2 months, I've been able to say to Wade, when you'll understand.
You'll understand when you have kids. I'm like, shut the fuck.
It's the best thing. I got married a week before Wade did as well. Same thing.
Oh yeah, and then for a week he's saying as a married man. It was funny because on our, it was kind of weird because people started out like, no, obviously doing the Seinfeld, not there's anything wrong with that. A week before I was like, oh, congratulations to Bernie's got married, and all of a sudden like a week later it's oh, Wade was married as well, and it's kind of like people are like, are you guys a couple? Because I thought, you both had fiancés, and we had to
ended up getting married at the same place as well. It was a lot of coincidences.
It
where
was
people
the
were like,
same place, wasn't it?
Wait a minute.
Well, you guys didn't plan that?
Oh well, not really. No, it just kind of
It's kind of easier.
I don't want to
You
say
just
fate.
So you let him do all the work, basically, and then you're like, he
just
was like your
piggybacked
Yelp
it.
review. What do
Yeah,
you guys do TripAdvisor here? Use your TripAdvisor review.
I was,
oh,
I
that
was the
works. I'll do
tester.
that. Yeah.
I was the
Smart.
litmus test, if you will.
That's the litmus test.
But what
He's
I was
sciencing things up in here.
can't help it. But what I think is very interesting, especially with young kids, is that there's a lot of data out there that says the parents are the most influential person in their life up to about 5 or 6, and then after that it becomes their peers. So once your kid turns 5 or 6, I'm going to go out on a limb and say you guys are older than 5 and 6.
Oh, God, of course they are. You're kidding.
Some kids have.
with you?
What if one wasn't? And you just don't know that, Maybe one had an unusual gland problem. You've got to be considerate to these things. Anyway, after about 5 or 6, you have to relinquish some control, and it becomes their peer things. The peers become a greater influence. So at that point, you want your kid to be one of those kids that is essentially a pain in the ass that's constantly asking why. Well, why is that? Why is that? And if someone can't give you those answers or can't honestly tell you that we don't know, then is that really a peer you want your kid hanging out with? Like, is that someone, if you've got a teacher, even at the school you're at, who says, why? Because I said so.
Yeah,
is that really what's
super
going to allow
dangerous.
us to build a next generation of healthy, skeptical kids? And
Yeah.
of course not.
Yeah.
You don't want that. There is nothing wrong with people in the teaching profession saying, I don't know, I'll see if I can find it out for you. And I think we do often, especially in Australia, I'm not so much sure about the US educational system. My wife is American, so I have a slight insight. She tells me she wasn't the best student, though, so maybe
I
it's a
wasn't
bit
either,
different
so
there.
I don't know how much I can
Well,
help
let's
you.
be honest, I don't think anyone in this panel was the best student.
That's a fair point. But I think a lot of people put this undue pressure on their teachers, and if it's, say, a science teacher, okay, just because that's the area I'm most comfortable with, they say, well, if your science teacher doesn't know this about evolution, then obviously evolution is wrong. That teacher can't explain it. But we have to bear in mind, that science teacher might have had their training in physics. And they've done no evolution since high school themselves. But we're expecting them to teach 15, 16-year-old kids about Darwinian, neo-Darwinian principles.
And they're also overworked and underpaid. Like, we can't just put everything on the educational system. It's like that really does start at home. I also think that we put too much pressure, and there's a reason for it. Of course, there's a biological, a psychological reason to have this conversation about children, but I think we should also be having this conversation about adults, because the adults are the ones shaping the children. And in many cases, the kids are quite skeptical, or, maybe they're credulous, but it's normal for kids to be credulous because, of course, they don't have that ability yet to edit, right? They just kind of just trust my parents and everything that they say until I start to see that they were wrong about that thing, which is a big day, and it's an important and emotional day when you realize your parents are fallible. But then it's really about the fact that I think the young adults and the older adults, at least in American culture, are they're not embodying any of these things that we're talking about. And it really comes down to these cultural norms. Like, we don't have a healthy zeitgeist right now for skepticism. And so those kinds of things have to change. And there's no one answer to this. There's like that's again like why I like that there's people who have all these different approaches with the same goal in mind. But yes, we often do talk about the children, which is important, but I think we leave out a massive part of the equation, which is their parents and the politicians and the voting public and the people that actually can affect, I think, real change.
So a lot of those people who are affecting real change, they're going to get their information, they're going to get their ideas from news sources. And about 15, 20 years ago, most Australians anyway were getting most of their news from basically two outlets. There was News Corp and Fairfax.
I'm sure you're familiar with these, Cara.
Absolutely.
One's Murdoch Press.
Oh, gotcha. They're all Murdoch Press now, aren't they? Yeah.
Okay, now we've got the internet though. We've got things like Breitbart, and then we've got things at the other end, sort of like The Guardian and things like that as well. So a lot of people are able to pick and choose the news that suits their almost preconceived narrative. So if we've got adults able to effectively choose your own story, how can we expect the adults to educate the kids and to educate each other? Like, who do we believe?
It's hard. I mean, when we talk about that difference between what is post-truth, what is fake news, I mean, fake news as Trump defines it versus fake news as it's actually defined, I mean, it's a personal decision that a lot of people have to make. We cannot force people to think outside the box, and we cannot force people to listen to other opinions. And there's a natural, normal proclivity to want to stick to what is safe and comfortable and to like continue your confirmation bias. Like, it doesn't feel good to be wrong and to have to go through the process of changing your mind. It's quite uncomfortable for people to do. And so I think a lot of times we can do stuff bottom up, like training, like we were talking about with kids, but we have to do things top down. It is a massive difference when you look at the way that Canadian politicians talk on the news versus the way that American politicians talk on the news. And when we're not seeing our own leaders saying things like, I was wrong and I've looked at the evidence and I've decided to change my mind, or saying, you know, I was reading this report and it really made me start to think about this problem. That's not how our politicians talk, and it's really problematic because it reinforces the black and white thinking that is already safe and comfortable for us. It's like an extreme version of the worst biases we can possibly have when we approach problems. And so, I mean, how do we fix this? We should not be policing the news. I do not think that's the appropriate way to fix it. I am a huge free speech advocate in the purest sense of that. But at the same time, I think that there's always going to be a group of people who says that the New York Times is fake news and that the New York Times is super slanted. But the New York Times is a very moderate news outlet. You know, the Washington Post, yes, they are slanted more liberal in America. I am one of these people who tends to believe that reality has a liberal bias, you know, so it's hard for me to say, but in my view, it's much more moderate. You can absolutely tell the difference between like a Breitbart news, like you were talking about, and maybe some of the opinion pages on Huffington Post or on The Guardian. Those things are much more kind of diametrically opposed. But I do think there are outlets that do a very good job of only reporting the facts and only reporting data, and at least trying from a journalistic perspective to maintain some editorial ethics. Like, that's what J School teaches people. And a lot of the people who are working at these types of outlets are trained journalists, and I respect them, you know, with my everything. The problem is I don't think people really understand what journalism is, because they can't tell the difference between an opinion post or a blog post and like a long-form article. They don't know what goes into those things, and they don't know which bylines to be following. Yeah. There was a study about, I think, American media literacy in students, and it was really, really depressing. I think it's something we should be teaching more in school, because we haven't caught up with technology. So we teach kids maybe how to use the library, you know, instead of like the card catalog. You guys remember card catalog?
What's a library?
Yeah. We used to have to do the card catalog with the Dewey Decimal System and all, and now we just like Google it. And so we do have that kind of media literacy training, but we don't have media literacy training like, read this article. Is there bias in this article? What are their primary sources? Can you find their primary sources? Like, most kids will just read a headline And of course, headlines are snappy. They're like, is so-and-so going to blah, blah, blah? And it's like, no. The answer is always no when they ask that question. But it's to get you to read it, and people don't read past the headline.
Yeah.
And you legit see comments about that. It makes me crazy. You see comments where people are answering the headline.
Clickbait.
And you're like, didn't you read all the text underneath it? It's insanity.
Yeah, it's funny because, like, now they're kind of pushing some academics, and it's not really I guess you'd say a large amount of academics. But some academics are actually pushing for allowing students to actually bring their computer into exams.
Yeah.
Because teaching them, how to search, using reliable and valid data and sources and things like that. So it'd be interesting to see, how our testing systems across the globe change.
I mean, that is obviously more important, but you do need foundational knowledge. And I think that we already see that between, let's say, high school. You guys call it high school?
Yes, we do.
Between high school and university and then graduate school.
Slow down there, graduate school. Do we have graduate? Yeah, we have graduate school, don't we?
You guys have graduate school.
Post-grad.
Post-grad. Oh, I see. So graduate school would be like master's and then PhD or a professional, a JD, a law degree or something like that, or medical degree. Is that the more you get into it, like I'm a PhD student right now. I did a master's. I started a PhD and dropped out like 10 years ago. Whoops. So I decided to go back, but I don't have like tests. I'm a PhD student. We don't take tests. We write papers mostly, and we make arguments. And if we did have a test, it would and there are a couple of like statistics where you might have to do, but it's an open book test. It's not about like, can you remember this equation? Like no one cares. Can you look it up and then can you use it and can you problem solve with it? But that takes a while to get to that point. And it would be great if we could be having those kinds of assessments at the undergraduate level. But it is kind of a tall order. I mean, you have to teach that kind of approach to the world.
Yeah.
It doesn't always come naturally.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about here, right?
Well, I'm interested in how we've talked about this. How do you guys check your own biases? Everyone's got their own biases.
Oh, I don't. I'm just fully biased. Love it. I just have all the right biases, so I don't have to.
I just tell the person to piss off. Yeah. Well, actually, it's funny because on Friday we had this discussion. It was about trophy hunting.
Ooh, this is a good one. One of my best friends is writing about this a lot. He actually is going to write a book about it.
Yeah.
He's done a lot of, his name's Jason Goldman, if you're interested in his byline, and he's written a few features for like National Geographic and stuff about trophy hunting.
Yeah, it's so
complicated.
One of the ways in which the conservation industry in certain countries is getting funded is through this trophy hunting. So, people paying ridiculous amounts of money to shoot an animal that is either killing other animals or is too old and will die shortly. And it was a really uncomfortable kind of thing because I said to Bern, I'm like, oh, these guys are dicks, they're
This is
going...
on the back of the change in America where Trump's allowed trophy...
Yeah, that just happened. That's true. Oh, gosh. But also, you guys remember Cecil the Lion? I think that was like national news.
Yeah.
And those kinds of things made this really relevant, right?
Yeah.
And it's complicated. It's ethically complicated.
Yeah.
But I love that. I love it when things that are ethically nebulous are trending in the news cycle because it gets people to talk. We're seeing that right now in the United States where it's not... Bear with me. Harvey Weinstein is not ethically nebulous. It's pretty obvious what's going on there. But then you'll
Disclaimer.
see, exactly, disclaimer. But then you see and then Brett Ratner and all these people in Hollywood that are like horrible, misogynists, like actual kind of predators. And then you have the Louis C.K. situation, which is like he's being lumped in with all these other people. And like maybe the things that he did are bad. Are they as bad as Harvey? Did he actually break any law? And these are questions, and it's okay to have a strong opinion one way or the other. But I also think it's even more okay to engage and talk about why we have those opinions and where are our, how are we coming down to this? Do you guys know Louis C.K. here?
Yes.
Yeah, he's big here, right? Yeah, because that was one of those hard ones where it was like, no, not you. No, but I love him. And so, a lot of people, even within the scientific community, we're of these two minds about it. Like, do we want to make a decision about how we feel about this person based on their personal life? Do we want to make a decision based on their professional life? I mean, JFK, like we have people in the United States culture at least who did not have the best track records, and it's like obviously we think about what was the time, but whatever.
Did not or do not?
Did not
or do not
or do not what?
have the best track record. I would argue that there are some people present in the United States that do not have the best track record
Oh,
in positions of power.
Oh, all people? It's more like you're closer to the truth if you
I'm
say
being
all
facetious,
people
if
than
I'm
a
honest,
few
I'm being
people.
facetious.
Exactly, yeah. But no, not everybody, but
It's
it's sort of
funny.
the exception to the rule at this point.
It's funny how those ethical issues come up in science, like a lot of the research done by like the Nazi Party, like, Nazi
Yeah.
scientists, and you're like, oh, do we use it? Like,
Yeah.
if someone is willing to allow those things to happen to a group of people,
And we generally don't. I mean, the good news is we generally don't. Like, there were some principles that were established, but for the most part, we know that, a lot of that research was, coerced is a light word for that reason, but it doesn't really apply.
Yeah.
But also, America has a pretty gross track record for that, right? Operation Paperclip, if you've never heard of it, it's a really interesting, there's a great book about it, was all about taking Nazi scientists out of Germany right after World War II and employing them in America, sort of giving them a
von
pat-
Braun.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Saturn V.
And this is these kinds of ethical problems, I think, we're not going to solve them sitting on this panel, but I would much rather
No, we
be
are.
informed.
We are going to solve them right now.
I would much rather our informed electorate be having conversations about things that are ethically nebulous than actually struggling over things where the jury is not still out, where there is consensus across anybody who has ever taken the time to research these things, yet certain people might be making decisions purely based on emotion and not at all based on evidence. We have to find that balance between the two.
I'm going to go on a limb here and say, just from my ignorant standpoint in Australia, not saying Australians are ignorant, I'm not saying that, but just about American politics, is that there seems to be the Republican Party just seems to be moving further and further to the right, where it's kind of like the Democrats seem to be kind of a bit more centralist now. It's kind
The Democrats are conservative in our country. Yeah, like a lot of people are really pushing for a three-party system. They have been for a long time because they have a hard time even, agreeing with either of them. You're right. Democrats are very, very centrist. They're very middle of the road. And then some people, but then we've got like the Green Party, but that doesn't really answer a lot of our questions because Green people tend to historically
Let's not be
a bit
racist, please. Bern's wearing a green shirt right now.
Gosh, you're so. But there is a lot of weird anti-science sentiment. Like that's where you might see some of the anti-vax coming through, and some of the pro-homeopathy weirdness. And so that's a bummer because even though I might be more politically aligned, they're really anti-GMO and anti-big business. And so I'm not really aligned in that way. There's actually a friend of mine who's a physicist at Los Alamos, and I hope I get this right. They've launched this new political party called the Party of Reason and Progress. And so, and it's sort of a science-based political party, which is really interesting. And we're starting to see a movement within the United States of scientists. This is a very reactionary, March for Science movement after Trump was elected, of people running for local government with strong science backgrounds, because we just don't have that. We don't have evidence-based governance, almost at all in our country. It's like a new concept to people.
A lot of people have been calling for that for a while now. I know Neil deGrasse Tyson, almost every talk he goes to, he will stand up and speak about the lack of scientists we have in Parliament, or wherever you want to call it, whether it's mostly businessmen and lawyers now running the country. Recently, there has been a shift as well away from lawyers running the country as politicians to businessmen. So that's where you get people like Donald Trump. They're less informed.
Who's
by
not
law
even a
and more
good
informed by business.
businessman, by the way. He's like a failed businessman.
Yeah, 7 bankruptcies?
Yeah, something like
7
that.
bankruptcies,
Yeah, it's
that's-
really effective.
Yeah.
Bouncing back. I got resiliency. That
Yeah,
should have been a
that's a very
platform,
resilient
right?
person.
Yeah. It's easy to be resilient when you're filthy rich and you come from money.
Yeah, we have a science party over here. What's one of the
Oh, has everyone heard
members'
of,
names?
hang on,
Gamma-
Meow Ludo Disco, Meow Disco Gamma Meow Meow.
What?
Anyone heard of that guy?
That's a human being?
Yeah, okay,
That's a
yeah.
human being.
That's
not
the
a joke.
coolest name I've ever heard.
He made the news because he got, what is his, we got this Opal pass over here, which when you walk
He
on a train, you
bioengineered
boop.
himself for train pass,
yeah.
and
Yeah, okay.
just to keep up, we've been keeping tabs on this guy because he's a fascinating figure. He's now running against Barnaby Joyce, who, as some of you may have known, because of his dual citizenship, was taken out of Parliament. So Meow Ludo is currently running against Barnaby Joyce. So if we have any Queensland voters here and you want to influence some of your other statesmen, there you go. Tell them about Meow Meow. There you go.
Oh my gosh, I love that.
It is. It's pretty amazing.
See, and you just think American politics is interesting.
It's super weird. Right? Yeah, but we are seeing this really cool movement of more scientists running and also more women running. And there's actually organizations that are starting to get hip to the fact that the deck has been stacked and that we don't have equal opportunity, and it's much more difficult to kind of get your foot in the race at this point. And so we're starting to realize, oh, we have these funding organizations and we have these backing organizations whose sole purpose is to get qualified female candidates a leg up so that they can be competitive, because we're sort of playing a catch-up game.
What's it been like for you as a female science communicator? Have you had hurdles to overcome?
I mean, obviously, yes, but it's so hard. Like, I think you ask most female science communicators or scientists or people who work in Hollywood, like, what are the things you deal with? And it's almost like, do you have time for a full therapy session? Because we really, we have to put those things to bed. Okay. We have to put those things to bed in order to be effective. And so it's really unfortunate that the walls are up and that we're hardened and that it's like, well, yeah, if you ask any woman, it's so funny. I was having a conversation with a friend, and I won't use his name because I don't want to throw him under the bus, because he's a really nice guy and he's really smart. Call him
Steve.
We'll call him Steve. Well, but it's not Steve. I don't want to call him Steve.
All right, guys, it's obviously Steve. I don't know.
It actually is not Steve, but it's actually a friend of mine who's a comedian who's quite progressive. And he was saying, like, what is happening in the world today? These poor women, and there's all these predators everywhere, and like everything's turned upside down, and how can this be happening? And I'm like, you realize this has been happening this whole time, right? Like, just people know about it now. Like, it is no different for me. It might be different for you because you're more aware of it now, but like, women have been dealing with this since the dawn of time. You know what I mean? And so, and I mean, it was really bad before, and now it's just the leftover of the bad. And we're not, like, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I think, said the other day, it was the best thing. Oh my gosh, I'm going to totally butcher her quote, but they were like, what would gender parity on the Supreme Court look like in the United States? And she said, when all 9 people sitting on the bench are women. And people were like, you're a feminazi. Like, oh, what are you talking about? Like, you don't really want equality. And she's like, why? There have been plenty of times when it was 9 men.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Like, historically, it's not about 50-50 for a lot of people. It's about, it's kind of like when you get in a fight with your significant other, and they say something really horrible.
Okay, let me just take notes because I need much advice.
This is really good advice here. And they say something really horrible and really hurtful. And then afterward, you sort of make up, but then they just act like nothing changed. You're like, no, you have to be just as nice to me as you were mean to me before we're back to a parity level, right?
I get it now.
So you got to do things that are ultra nice until we get back to a place where we've met in the middle. We've got to swing the other direction. And so...
to my wife, if you're listening to this, please pay attention to Cara.
And so what is it like as a female science communicator? It's all the things. It's all the things that you hear all the time. It's harassment, it's sexual advances. But my biggest thing is, this is why I love podcasting. It's a little different in a live show. But actually the energy here is really
Wade's
great.
wearing pants today? That's quite
Wade's wearing pants. I don't usually
Was I wearing pants
when
during
I
the
podcast.
interview we did with Cara
I'm not
over
answering that,
Skype?
Wade.
I probably wasn't wearing pants either. No judgment.
That's right, because I remember I spoke to her, I'm like, so...
Why am I in the middle?
Because I was like, Cara, she's like, oh, are we going to do like a live feed kind of thing, camera? And I'm like, oh, well, it's up to you. And she's like, oh, no, I'd rather not. I'm
Yeah,
like,
exactly. I'd really
You're
rather
not wearing pants either, are you?
Yeah. But part of it, too, is that, and I've seen this a lot, I'll do a thing on TV, and that's fine because I don't usually get a lot of feedback. Sometimes I'll get a few nice tweets. I saw you on the show. It was informative. That's great. I'll guest on somebody else's YouTube show. I don't have a YouTube show, but I'll guest on other people's YouTube shows, and you look at the comments, and it's like all about my boobs or like all about my lip ring, which is extra weird. Like, people are really preoccupied with that thing in my lip. And so, and you're like, oh my gosh, I was talking about this really intense science thing, and I was doing all this research, and I was really proud of my performance, and all they care about were like, did she put on 10 pounds, or she needs to put on 10 pounds, whatever it is, there's always something. And when you podcast, like, they can't see you. And it actually takes that entire variable out of the equation. And that's why I love podcasting. I mean, A, because I'm way lazy and hate putting makeup on in the morning. I only wear it when I'm doing things like this. And B, because I get to focus on the content and my listeners get to focus on the content. And it's really empowering as a woman that's a way that the playing field gets a little more leveled. And they still will do things like talk about my vocal fry and tell me that I sound like, all the time. I always get the vocal fry comments.
The fact that you have to mention that says a lot.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
I was actually going to make a comment on some of your jewelry, but it was your necklace.
Oh, you like it?
Yeah,
Dopamine.
what is
Is
it?
it
What is
This is
it?
dopamine.
Dopamine.
I actually got this because I did a story on Bill Nye about addiction, and I wanted to nerd it up and wear a dopamine necklace during the
that's
addiction
cool.
story. I have so much like
cool.
dorky science jewelry.
It's pretty organic, Cam. Just throwing it out there. It's
Yeah.
good. Subtle.
Subtle.
yeah.
Yeah, it's important. Serotonin, right there.
Oh,
I
wow,
love
tattoo.
it. See, it's super
I come
cool.
up, show everyone. That's rad. That's rad.
I love science tattoos.
You two
so
get
cool.
together and everyone's really happy.
There
Yeah.
we go. Yeah.
Science tattoos are so much fun. If you guys haven't come across, what's his name? Carl Zimmer's book, Science Inc., I really recommend it. It's a great coffee table book. It's just all tattoo art with different science principles and things. And he divides it into like physics and biology and chemistry. And
That's right.
it's really cool.
Yeah, if I was going to get a tattoo, I don't know with tattoos. It's just like the permanency of it. I just can't deal with it.
So yeah, people say that all the time. Like, oh, but what if I change my mind? I say, just get another one. Like, that's really, you just get another one. You keep getting, and then they always say, yeah, you just keep going. And then they always say, what are you going to do when you're super old and like it's all wrinkly and gross? And you go, it reminds me of when I was like young and hot. Like, why would I not want that, right?
I'm going to grow a kick-ass beard and hang out with other tattooed old guys.
Exactly. Like, I'll look like a total
Car,
badass.
I've never been young and hot. Like, I've been young, but definitely not young and hot.
So I have a few science tattoos. I've got, this is Archaeopteryx lithographica. It's the Berlin specimen, in case if you're like a huge fossil nerd. And I also have down my ribs, I have a Carl Sagan quote. It says, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." And I love that. And then
that's
all my other
rad.
tattoos aren't sciencey, but those
That's
two
rad.
are. Yeah.
That's
it's
so
fun.
good. But you've got tattoos, don't
I
you?
got a few. One's just so I don't get lost. It's a compass. I've got a picture of the Earth on my back. That's quite good. Once again, so if I get found somewhere, they know where I'm from.
Love that.
But yeah, not any hardcore science ones. No Carl Sagan quotes, for
Yeah,
example.
you know.
We-
There's a
we-
Sagan baby back there.
There is. That's pretty rad.
Yeah.
There's a baby named
yeah.
Sagan hanging out backstage. He's
Yeah.
the cutest thing ever.
There's a little baby, and the mother called it Sagan, and we're like, oh, that is the raddest name.
I
So I'm
know.
gonna steal it.
Could have a baby first.
Well, your baby's name's Luna, which is rad.
Yep,
That's
I'm
cool.
sure my wife is thrilled about you telling everyone out there what my child's name is. Yep.
That was really uncomfortable, you
Oh, I
guys.
know. This is what happens, see. This is why I'm thinking of quitting the podcast. This guy's just a dick the whole time.
This is actually one of the more comfortable podcasts we've had.
I
Yeah.
have a friend who had a baby the day of the solar eclipse in the U.S. This recent solar eclipse, and so her middle name is Luna because of that. Yeah,
that's
so
awesome.
sweet. I know.
I really wanted a unique name. This is just ruining it for me.
No,
both
all
of
the
you.
solar eclipse babies will be named Luna, but beyond that, there's it's just people's labradoodles are named Luna.
What about it's a boy? You can't call a boy.
You can't call a boy Luna.
You can't call a boy
Yeah.
Luna, no.
No,
You
can't.
could.
Yeah, but you could call him
Soul.
Moon.
No, I was going to say you could call him Stella. I'm like, oh, that's
No,
definitely
not Stella either. Is that a weird? I feel like that would be a cool middle name, Moon.
Moon.
I would just call a boy Moon.
Oh, who was it that, was it Frank Zappa?
Yeah.
What was his, Moonbeam
Moonbeam is a bit-
Moon Unit.
I go,
There you go.
like a straight moon.
There you go.
I don't think it's
Moon
bad.
Unit, that's terrible.
Moon Unit.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
I just got an image of someone flashing their ass then turning around when I get Moon Unit. You know?
It's true. Dual meanings there. Dual
a
meanings.
big dude, like a unit, just turn around.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll move on. We'll try and bring this back down to a bit more science. Now we've got about 12 odd minutes to go. So
Great.
One more question, and then if
Great.
you're
What do you
happy,
mean
I
by
will-
that?
I love 12 minutes is a long time. I was afraid you were going to be 3 minutes and we'd have to rush.
Now I know when you were doing your talk, you said you liked opening it up, and I think that would be.
What are you
Love
talking
that. No, like for questions. For questions.
Jeez.
Okay. I'm on the same wavelength here.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah,
I'll just sit over here and drink the rest of my cider.
out of your lovely Talk Nerdy mug available in the store
Well,
here.
yeah, I was going to put red wine in it, but
But apparently
Cara
that was
wasn't
beyond
too
the pale.
impressed. Yeah, it's a bit too
This
far.
makes me really happy, actually. So an ex-boyfriend of mine, who's my college boyfriend, is a really brilliant potter, and he builds out the kilns and does these intense wood fires that take all night. And so he made a bunch of like custom mugs just for my store, and it made me feel very special. So it's like a one-of-a-kind, hand-thrown. Yeah,
It's a huge mug as well. So if you're really into coffee, or if you're a postgraduate student, this would be ideal.
or beer. It's full of
more
beer
of a
right now.
stein.
Right?
No, it's cider. It's more of a stein.
Oh, cider? I thought you were drinking beer out of that. Oh, is it hard cider?
I don't even know, but I've got a buzz.
Yes. Now, my last question was: do you think all news is in some way biased these days?
These days, I think, is a qualifier that I would disagree with. I think all news is somewhat biased because all news is written by people. All science is somewhat biased because it's people doing science. And I
You
think
did
that...
have that's somewhat disclosed in front of science, though.
No, and news, somewhat. Because I do think that the scientific ethos and the journalistic ethos are actually quite similar, and I think that there's a lot of crossover between the way that journalists approach doing journalism and the way that scientists approach doing science. So I think that there are always going to be people who are fraudulent and people who are agenda driven, and that is going to be a difficult thing, but that's overt. It's always going to happen. We have to watch out for it. That's why I think outlets like Retraction Watch are really important because they do a really good job of exposing that. But then I also think that there are always going to be intrinsic biases that come from being human, and that's why it's good to have peers and editors and a process that's somewhat self-correcting. But I think we also have to be really careful. This is why I feel really lucky that my uni training, my
Well done.
undergraduate, my college training was in psychology and philosophy. So I got to take these great classes like the philosophy of natural science or the philosophy of psychology and the mind, where we really took a different approach. And we said, okay, whereas I think a lot of times we're like, this scientific method is the gold standard and we can never be wrong if we just trust science. It's like, no, it's the best we have, but it's still riddled with problems. And if we refuse to admit that those problems are there, we're not going to be aware of the problems when they come out. So the more that we're willing to say, okay, we're always iterating, it's always changing. As journalists or as scientists, we're always seeking the truth. I don't think we're ever quite there, but we're always seeking it, and we really do take a strong ethical and moral stance. That's important. Scientists, I think, it's a dangerous thing. I shouldn't paint them with a broad brush. There's a fair amount of scientists who think that ethics is not their problem and say, I'm going to leave that up to the ethicists. I used to think that way. I just want to have an unregulated approach to just pure discovery, and we can leave the regulation to the politicians, and we can leave the ethics to the ethicists. But the truth is, we need to be thinking about these things as we're designing our experiments and as we're carrying these things out. That's how things like it's not how things like Nazi Germany happen, but it's how some of those experiments happen. It's even how some of the kind of hallmark experiments that we use in psychological science that we cite all the time, but we could never do now, happen because we weren't thinking about the ethical ramifications. Like I'm blanking on his name, not Mesmer, the guy who did the shock. Shoot, what was his name? No. I'll come up with it. I can't believe it.
Robot monkey one.
You just see Cara run out in 30 minutes and just scream into his
I'm
microphone.
going to do that. I'm looking it up right now. And there was a really great film made about him with Sarsgaard, where you would be in the room and he would shock people if they got the thing wrong, and then even beyond where they thought they were dead. And the psychological implications of that were really dangerous. And we can't do those kinds of experiments anymore because of that, because of things like informed consent, which is pretty important. I'll come up with it.
No.
You guys talk for a second so I can Google this.
All right, well, look, because of Cara's articulate nature, I think we've run out of questions.
Stanley Milgram. Thank you.
Well, I think one of the reasons why science has been so successful is because it removes the human element out of it in a way. Like it's kind of like this is what the data said. It attempts to. And it was really interesting. We spoke to Professor Brian Nosek. He's the psychology professor who did the study that found that there was a big reliability problem in psychological studies. I think it was over 60% were found to be...
6% of studies were found to not be
like that.
repeatable.
Yeah, they're calling it the reproducibility crisis.
Yeah.
It's a big problem.
So in doing so, we asked him, well, how can we trust science? Like it's got some serious flaws in it at the moment. And he said, well, yeah, but what method do you think found that out? It was
right.
And so yeah, exactly. So it's really
Brilliant.
interesting to kind of see. And as well, science is a method, and the method will get better, and the more that we kind of accept it, I think the easier it's going to be for us all in the long run, especially with issues like climate change.
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence, they'll sort it out. Robots will probably not worry about morals so much then.
No, they're not.
No.
Yeah,
Well,
it'll all be fine.
It'll
all be fine.
Yeah, unless you're standing at a bus stop and the car has to avoid an accident, and it's artificial intelligence or whatever.
So the thinking people, did they do this to you? It was kind of cruel and unusual, but I loved it.
Oh,
They're pulling the speakers aside. They'd be pissed that I'm probably saying this. this, but they're pulling the speakers aside and asking them these like intense ethical questions, and then you kind of answer and pontificate on it. And I guess I was like, what are you going to do with this? Oh, we'll figure it out later. But like, they're really hard questions to answer, and I love those. So coming back to what we were just talking
I
about.
don't think they bother with us. They even left my name up.
It was awesome. It was awesome. It's like Sci-gasm podcast, Wade and Cara Santa Maria. I'm like,
That's why I get to
shit,
sit in
man.
the middle. I'm in the middle there. Yeah. All right. Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for coming out. If you'd like to hear more, Cara is very active on Twitter. You can check her out at Cara Santa Maria on Twitter, and she's very good at getting answers. You can get really insightful answers. If you want less insightful answers and more smarmy responses, you can tweet at Sci-gasm podcast.
or follow us on Facebook, whatever website, and all that type of stuff.
And check
Cara's
out
appeared
Talk
more than
Nerdy,
once.
which is
Talk
awesome
Nerdy.
as well.
Thank
And like the
you.
mug, go get a mug. That's a big
Get a
mug.
mug,
Holds a
yeah.
lot
There's
of
a few
booze,
out there.
guys. A lot of booze.
Thanks very much for coming out, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. All right, before you go, can we get a photo quickly? Come on, up we go. Let's go.
Oh, photo. Yeah. Oh,